Beneath the shifting skin of the planet, there was a time when the world we know simply did not exist. No familiar coastlines, no scattering of continents, no ocean dividing one land from another, only a single, vast expanse of Earth bound together under the same sky. To imagine it, you have to let go of the map in your mind, to trade the blue and green globe we carry in memory for a place stranger, harsher, and yet deeply alive. This was Pangea, a world where deserts could stretch for thousands of miles without yielding to sea, where rivers crossed entire climates, and where the same winds might sweep from the tropics to the poles without once touching water. It is a name that flickers past in textbooks, a shape on a geological diagram. But what was it truly like to stand there? How did it feel to breathe its air, to walk its boundless land, to witness the life that thrived in its extremes? Was it a paradise for survival, or a crucible that shaped every creature that dared to call it home? Tonight we step quietly into that distant age, letting the earth unfold at its own pace. And if the thought of walking through this forgotten world stirs something in you, join us on this journey. You're watching Arcane Skies, and if you'd like to wander further into the past with us, tap like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where and when you're watching from. The story of Pangea does not begin with a dramatic crack of the earth or a sudden reshaping of continents. It begins with movements so slow they were almost invisible, yet powerful enough to redraw the face of the planet over hundreds of millions of years. Beneath our feet, the Earth's crust is not a solid, unmoving shell. It is a mosaic of immense plates that glide atop the hotter, softer mantle below. Today we measure their drift in inches or centimetres per year, a pace that seems insignificant until you understand the scale of time. Give these plates 100 million years, and they will shift whole continents across the planet, close oceans, or tear apart land that has stood united for ages. Long before Pangea existed, the world was a patchwork of smaller continents and scattered islands adrift on an ancient ocean. Names like Laurentia, Baltica, Gondwana, and Siberia belong to those fragments, a geography alien to modern eyes, yet built from the same bedrock we walk on now. In this earlier Earth, oceans widened and narrowed like slow tides. Mountain ranges rose where plates collided, and shallow seas spilled over lowlands, leaving behind layers of limestone that still rest in the crust. Over time, these fragments drifted toward one another, drawn together by the relentless push of tectonics. What began as faint lines of collision at the edges of continents became towering mountain belts, as rock folded and faulted under unimaginable pressure. The Appalachians in North America and parts of the Atlas Mountains in Africa still carry the scars of these unions, silent witnesses to an age when their peaks were young and raw. The collisions were not a single event, but a sequence, a slow choreography that lasted tens of millions of years. Oceans vanished as continents met, their waters squeezed away into new basins or lifted skyward in colossal waves. Chains of volcanic islands were swallowed, their molten hearts extinguished beneath rising mountain roots. If you could have flown above the earth in those days, though there were no wings yet to do so, you would have seen an ever-changing puzzle, its pieces creeping together, the deep blue of the Panthalassic Ocean wrapping around them like a single endless ribbon. At first, the process was almost imperceptible to the life that roamed these lands. Coastal swamps, rich with strange ferns and towering club mosses, continued to drink the humid air. Amphibians slithered between water and land, their limbs still learning the weight of the world. Giant dragonflies skimmed the forest canopy, their wings flashing like panes of living glass in the filtered sunlight. But slowly, the land masses grew closer. Climate patterns began to shift. Where once the ocean's breath had carried moisture far inland, the narrowing seas could no longer feed the same rains. New mountain chains altered wind and weather, casting shadows of drought over one side while trapping moisture on the other. Life adapted, as it always does. Plants that could tolerate drier air spread across uplands, and animals began to test the edges of harsher environments. The Earth was rehearsing for Pangea. As the final collisions approached, the world entered an age of contrasts. In the far south, Gondwana carried ice sheets the size of modern continents, their slow grind etching scars into the bedrock. In the tropics, coal swamps pulsed with life, each layer of decaying plant matter sinking under its own weight to form the black seams that, hundreds of millions of years later, humans would mine for fuel. Between these extremes, dry belts expanded, their red soils rich with iron, a sign of the arid heat that baked them under relentless sun. This was a planet in transition, each shift in its surface a signal that the supercontinent was nearly at hand. When the last great ocean between the converging continents finally closed, it marked not just the end of a geologic chapter, but the beginning of something unprecedented. Nearly all of Earth's land now touched, from the polar ice to the equatorial swamps, from barren plateaus to volcanic coasts. Every landscape was part of one immense, connected whole. The interior of this land lay farther from the sea than any place today, creating climates no modern region can truly replicate. Deserts stretched for thousands of miles, uninterrupted by the cooling presence of water. Monsoons swept across the coasts, but could not quench the aridity of the heartland. Yet along the edges, where ocean met shore, rainforests and wetlands flourished, feeding rivers that carved deep channels into the continent's flanks. Those rivers were lifelines, carrying not only water, but nutrients and life itself into the interior. Early reptiles, no longer bound to the water for reproduction, followed them inland, their eggs carried within hard shells that could survive far from the swamps of their ancestors. The amniotic egg was more than a biological innovation. It was a passport to the new world Pangea offered. And so the stage was set, a single vast continent, ringed by the endless sweep of Panthalassa, crowned with mountain ranges born of ancient collisions, divided between humid coasts and a dry, sun-baked core. The life that had adapted to smaller scattered continents now found itself in an open world without boundaries. A world where a creature could travel from what would one day be South America into what would one day be Asia without ever touching saltwater. But even in its unity, this was not a world of peace. The same forces that had fused the land together continued to stir beneath it, building heat and strain along the sutures that stitched the continent into one. Earthquakes rattled its seams. Volcanoes spilled their fire into the sky, their ash settling over forests and rivers alike. And above it all, the wind swept unhindered, crossing thousands of miles of unbroken land, carrying with them dust from the deserts, salt from the coasts, and the seeds of plants that would take root far from their home. To live in the first days of Pangea was to stand at the beginning of something vast and unpredictable, a chapter in Earth's story unlike any before or since, a moment when the planet felt both whole and restless. And as the sun rose over this united land, casting its light from one horizon to the other, without touching an ocean in between, the earth seemed to pause as if drawing breath before the next movement in its long, unhurried dance. In the heart of Pangea, far from the sound of waves or the scent of salt carried on a breeze, the world felt immeasurably large. The sun climbed slowly over horizons that seemed to retreat as you walked toward them, the air shifting from cool morning stillness into the dry heat of midday. Here, in the deep interior, distance meant more than space. It meant isolation. Without the moderating hand of the sea, summers pressed down with a weight that shimmered in the air, and winters stripped the warmth away until the nights grew sharp and cold. Rain was an infrequent visitor, its arrival marked by the smell of dust turning briefly to mud before the heat reclaimed it. This interior was a land of extremes, and it demanded the same from life that dared to endure it. Plants were sparse but purposeful. Early conifers stood like scattered sentinels, their needle-like leaves adapted to conserve every drop of moisture. Low cycads, crowned with stiff fronds, rooted themselves deep into the earth, their thick leaves resisting the dry winds. Here and there, seed ferns spread their broad fronds to capture the fleeting light of dawn before the day's heat would wither anything less resilient. Between them the ground was bare save for the trails of wind-blown sand and the pale scars of ancient riverbeds that only came to life during rare seasonal floods. In these moments of abundance, the land transformed. Streams swelled from distant mountains, their waters fanning into temporary wetlands that pulsed with activity. Amphibians ventured from their burrows to breed in shallow pools. Insects swarmed the air, in quick, shimmering clouds, their brief life cycles tied to the short-lived presence of water. Reptiles emerged from rocky shelters, following the movement of prey along the muddy banks. Then, as quickly as it had come, the water would fade. The pools shrank, the insects scattered, and the land returned to its patient stillness. Across this great arid core, the wind was a constant companion. It whistled low over open plains, swept dust into the sky, and carried fine grains hundreds of miles before letting them fall. These dust storms were more than a nuisance. They were part of the continent's lifeblood. Minerals lifted from the deserts would settle in distant forests and wetlands, feeding the soil far from their source. In this way, the interior spoke to the edges of the supercontinent, its dryness woven into the fertility of lands it would never touch. To travel here was to pass through landscapes where sound itself seemed rare. The soft hiss of wind, the crunch of stone underfoot, the distant cry of a creature adapted to emptiness. These were the rhythms of the place, and yet it was not lifeless. Small synapsids padded across the baked ground, their bodies low and efficient, conserving every ounce of energy. They hunted insects in the cool hours of dawn and dusk, retreating into shade during the height of the day. Larger herbivores moved in cautious patterns between the scattered oases, feeding on tough vegetation that could survive in these harsh conditions. Predators followed them, lean and deliberate, their survival measured not in speed but in patience. In such an environment, movement was often the key to life. Animals travelled long distances to find food or water, tracing invisible routes passed down through generations. Some followed the shifting edges of climate zones, where open woodlands blurred into grasslands, and grasslands faded into desert. These transition belts were the highways of Pangea, corridors where species from different regions cross paths. Fossil evidence tells us that the same species once walked on lands that are now separated by whole oceans, proof of a time when nothing stood between them but the sweep of land itself. The climate here was dictated by the continent's sheer size and its position straddling the equator. Winds carried moisture from Panthalassa toward the interior, but much of it fell as rain along the coastal margins, feeding dense forests and river systems before they could reach the core. What little remained was often lost to heat before it could quench the land's thirst. This imbalance created one of Pangea's most striking features, the sharp contrast between its edges and its heart. Along the coasts, rainforests thrived. In the centre, deserts ruled. The coasts themselves were dynamic worlds, shaped by the meeting of land and the vast global ocean. Here, warm, shallow seas flooded low-lying plains, and mangrove-like wetlands stretched for miles. Insects filled the air, amphibians basked on sun-warmed mud, and early reptiles hunted in the shadow of towering seed ferns. Seasonal monsoons swept in, drenching the land, swelling rivers, and feeding swamps that seemed to stretch without end. Life here moved with the rhythm of the tides and storms, each season bringing new abundance. The coastal forests were dense and layered, home to creatures adapted to humidity and shadow. Early therapsids, the so-called mammal-like reptiles, moved through the undergrowth, their sharp senses tuned to the rustle of prey. In the branches above, insects as large as modern birds beat their wings slowly, their compound eyes glinting in the dappled light. The ground beneath was thick with decomposing plant matter, a dark, fragrant layer that fed the roots of the forest and locked away carbon in quantities that would one day shape the climate of future ages. Rivers that began in the coastal uplands cut their way inland, carving valleys through rock and forest alike. Along their banks, life clustered in narrow fertile bands, creating green corridors that reached deep toward the arid zones. These rivers were the arteries of Pangea, carrying more than water. They carried connection. They linked ecosystems, offered migration routes, and provided a fragile lifeline to species that would otherwise vanish in the dryness of the interior. The further upriver you travelled, the more the landscape changed. Forests thinned, the ground turned red with iron-rich soils, and the scent of salt and decay gave way to the dry mineral smell of sun-baked stone. In these transitional lands, life shifted to match its surroundings. Trees grew smaller and farther apart, replaced by shrubs and hardy grasses. Grazers adapted to sparser food, moved in small groups, covering wide ranges to sustain themselves. Predators here were opportunists, willing to hunt whatever crossed their path. They might lie in wait at a waterhole for days, conserving energy in the heat until a thirsty animal ventured too close. In the background, the planet itself was never truly still. Tectonic forces strained against the seams of the supercontinent, sending occasional tremors through the ground. Volcanoes rose in places where the crust was weakest, their eruptions casting ash into the sky and draping fresh lava over the land. These moments could devastate local life, but they also enriched the soil, leaving behind fertile ground that would one day bloom again. For the creatures of Pangea, survival was a balance between endurance and opportunity. To live here meant to adapt not just to one climate or one ecosystem, but to a continent of them, all connected yet vastly different. It was a world of journeys, of following rivers from rainforest to desert, of tracing the shifting line between abundance and scarcity. And always overhead, the same sky stretched unbroken from one end of the land to the other, carrying the breath of the entire supercontinent in its winds. In the age of Pangea, the idea of isolation was a matter of distance, not division. No ocean stood between the forests and the deserts, between the cold uplands and the sweltering coasts. The land was one, and everything upon it, plant, animal, wind and water, was part of the same restless whole. Along Pangea's sweeping coasts, where the land met the boundless blue of Pantalassa, life unfolded in a way entirely different from the arid core. Here the scent of salt drifted inland on steady winds, mingling with the resin of coastal forests. The soundscape was a constant dialogue between sea and land, the low roar of waves breaking against rocky headlands, the rhythmic pull of tides across broad tidal flats, the chatter of insects, and the distant calls of reptiles basking in the sun. The coast was not a narrow strip, but a complex mosaic of habitats. Warm, shallow seas flooded low-lying plains, creating vast lagoons where sediment from rivers mixed with ocean water to form rich, muddy beds. These shallow zones were nurseries, cradling early fish and invertebrates. Ancient reefs, built not by the corals of today, but by earlier reef-building organisms, rose from the seabed in twisting shapes, their structures sheltering countless small creatures. The water here was clear and warm, fed by sunlight and nutrients carried downriver from the interior. Schools of primitive fish shimmered beneath the surface, their scales flashing in the light, while ammonites drifted gracefully, their coiled shells catching glints of colour as they turned in the currents. Just beyond the tidal shallows, the ocean floor dropped away into deeper, cooler waters, where larger predators patrolled. Early sharks, sleek and efficient, moved through the blue with patient precision, their senses tuned to the faintest vibrations. These open waters were the realm of endurance hunters, built to travel long distances along the unbroken coastline of the supercontinent. The connection between land and sea was constant. Rivers carried not only water, but the minerals and organic matter that fed the coastal ecosystems. Each flood season, swollen currents poured into estuaries, staining the water a deep green brown and delivering fresh nutrients that fueled explosive growth in marine life. Plankton bloomed in such abundance that it turned the water cloudy, drawing fish and filter feeders in from the open sea. In turn, these fish brought predators, and the cycle continued, season after season. On land, the edges of Pangea were thick with forests that thrived in the humid air. Towering seed ferns spread broad fronds above the undergrowth, their shadows dappled with the flicker of insect wings. Early conifers rose even higher, their trunks wrapped in spirals of resin-scented bark. The forest floor was a tangle of roots, fallen leaves, and pools of standing water alive with amphibians. Some were small, quick-bodied hunters of insects. Others were massive, their wide jaws lined with teeth designed for ambushing prey in the shallows. The coasts were a world of constant change. The tides shifted twice a day, flooding flats and revealing them again in long, glistening sweeps. Monsoons rolled in with the turning of the seasons, bringing torrential rains that transformed the land in hours. Rivers overflowed their banks, forests stood knee-deep in water, and the calls of breeding amphibians rose into a chorus that carried for miles. In some places, storms driven by the vast reach of Panthalassa battered the shoreline, tearing trees from their roots and reshaping the beaches overnight. Yet life here had adapted to these rhythms. Plants anchored themselves with deep, wide roots to withstand both flood and wind. Animals timed their breeding and migrations to the rise and fall of water. Even the insects, some with wingspans nearly as long as a human forearm, emerged in synchrony with the seasonal pulses, filling the air in shimmering swarms. Inland from the immediate coast, the land began to rise into low hills and volcanic uplands, remnants of the collisions that had forged the supercontinent. In these higher zones, the climate was still wet but cooler, the forest thinner. Here streams tumbled over rock, carving narrow gorges before joining the rivers that wound back toward the sea. Volcanic soils rich with minerals, fed dense stands of cycads and conifers whose cones held the next generation of the forest in tight protective spirals. Reptiles moved through these uplands with deliberate ease, their scales glistening in the filtered light. Some were small insectivores, quick to dart into the cover of ferns. Others were larger, omnivorous forms with sturdy jaws capable of cracking open tough seeds or crushing smaller animals. The therapsids, the mammal-like reptiles, were among the most versatile inhabitants here. Their teeth, more varied than those of most reptiles, allowed them to exploit different food sources. Some hunted in packs along riverbanks, their coordinated movements giving them an edge over solitary predators. These upland zones acted as a bridge between the wet coastal regions and the drier lands beyond. Animals moving inland would pass through them, feeding and resting before entering the more demanding environments of the open plains. In this way, the coastal and interior worlds of Pangea were linked, not by sudden shifts but by gradual transitions, each zone blending into the next. The ocean itself was as much a part of the land story as the forests and deserts. Pantalassa was unimaginably vast, its current circling the globe without the interruption of modern continents. Heat from the equator travelled toward the poles, while cooler waters sank and moved back toward the tropics in deep, slow loops. This movement regulated the climate of Pangea's coasts, bringing warmth to some regions and tempering the cold in others. In certain sheltered seas, like the Paleotethys along the eastern edge of the supercontinent, life flourished in quieter waters. These smaller seas acted as cradles of evolution, their isolation allowing unique species to develop, while still connecting to the larger ocean through narrow passages. Standing on one of Pangea's coastal cliffs, you would have seen no other continents on the horizon, only the unbroken sweep of water meeting the sky. The sunsets here might have been extraordinary. The light scattered by particles from distant volcanic eruptions, painting the clouds in bands of deep orange and crimson. At night, with no city lights to dull the darkness, the stars would have been sharp and countless, mirrored in the calm waters of sheltered bays. The edge of the supercontinent was a place of abundance, but also of fragility. A single storm could strip away a swath of forest. A shift in currents could starve a reef. Yet these changes were part of the rhythm, and life adapted not in spite of them, but because of them. Each disturbance cleared space for something new to grow, each loss opening a path for a different form of life to take hold. In the coasts of Pangea, you could trace the pulse of the entire world, the tides, the storms, the migrations, and the endless exchange between land and sea. They were boundaries, yet they were also connections, tying the heart of the supercontinent to the deeper, restless waters that surrounded it on all sides. And as the waves washed against the shore, they carried with them the memory of a planet still shaping itself, a world both ancient and new, waiting for the next turn in its long story. Moving inland from the human embrace of the coasts, the forests began to change. The towering seed ferns and thick mats of undergrowth gave way to a more open canopy, the spaces between trunks widening until sunlight poured more freely onto the forest floor. Here conifers began to dominate, their needle-like leaves and resin-rich bark adapted to survive in climates less drenched by constant rain. The air grew drier, but still carried the scents of plant resin and warm earth, mingling with the faint tang of minerals from streams winding through the hills. These transitional forests were quieter than their coastal counterparts. The chorus of amphibians faded, replaced by the steady hum of insects and the occasional cry of a reptile moving between patches of shade. Early therapsids padded along game trails worn into the soil, their broad feet leaving shallow impressions in the soft ground. Some were herbivores, their barrel-shaped bodies swaying with each step as they grazed on cycads and low-growing shrubs. Others were predators, sleeker in build, with narrow heads and keen eyes that flicked toward every rustle in the undergrowth. The variety here was remarkable, each species filling a niche shaped by the balance of moisture, temperature, and available food. Small rivers cut through the land, their waters clear and cool as they descended from distant mountains. Along their banks, vegetation grew thick again. Ferns unfurled delicate fronds, and horsetails clustered in dense green stands. These riparian zones acted as lifelines, supporting pockets of lushness, even where the surrounding terrain began to lean toward dryness. Animals followed these ribbons of life, using them as migration routes or as permanent territories in a shifting landscape. The presence of water-shaped behaviour. Grazers lingered longer, predators became more patient, and insects swarmed in greater numbers. As the land sloped upward toward the interior plateaus, the climate shifted once more. Summers were hotter, the rain shorter, and less predictable. The soil here was rich in iron, giving it a deep red hue that contrasted with the green of sparse vegetation. Wind moved more freely, carrying dust that settled in the folds of conifer needles and coated the bark of trees. This dust was not lifeless. It carried with it nutrients from far-off places, linking ecosystems that never touch through an invisible exchange. Farther on, the openness expanded into rolling plains, dotted with isolated stands of trees and low, hardy shrubs. The horizon stretched wider here, the sky pressing down in a way that made the land seem even larger. In the cooler hours of the morning, herds of herbivorous synapsids moved slowly across the grass-like ground cover, their movements deliberate and unhurried. They grazed in small groups, their heads dipping low to tear at fibrous plants, before lifting again to scan the surroundings for predators. Among them, smaller reptiles darted in and out of shade, their scales catching the light as they hunted insects stirred up by the larger animals passing. Predators in this region relied less on bursts of speed and more on endurance. Stalking across the open land, they kept a steady pace, wearing down their quarry over long distances. Fossil trackways from similar environments suggest that some of these hunters moved in loose groups, their paths converging around water sources or narrowing into single-file trails through patches of denser vegetation. Above, the sky was often a flawless blue during the dry season, the clarity broken only by the thin silhouettes of large insects drifting on the air currents. When storms did come, they were dramatic. Dark clouds built on the horizon, towering higher and higher until they blotted out the sun. The first gusts brought cooler air, bending the grasses and carrying the scent of rain. Lightning forked in the distance, and then the downpour arrived, sheets of water hammering the ground, swelling dry stream beds into rushing torrents. For hours the land came alive, the parched soil releasing the stored heat of weeks into the rising steam. Animals drank deeply, plants swelled with moisture, and the rivers carried a fresh surge of life toward the coasts. But just as quickly, the rain would pass, leaving behind a transformed yet temporary world. In the days that followed, the grasses would green, flowers would bloom, and insects would hatch in staggering numbers, creating a brief window of abundance before the cycle returned to dryness. The transition zones between forest and open plain were among the most dynamic parts of Pangea. They acted as crossroads, places where species from wetter and drier regions overlapped, each bringing its own adaptations to the shared space. Herbivores from the forests moved out to graze on the plains during wet periods, while desert-adapted animals ventured in during the cooler seasons to take advantage of the richer plant life. These minglings allowed genetic exchange between populations, a constant blending that would shape the course of evolution across the continent. Even here, far from the pounding surf of Pantalassa, the influence of the ocean could still be felt. Moisture carried inland on seasonal winds left its mark in the growth rings of trees and in the mineral traces found in soil layers. Storm systems that began over warm coastal waters could sweep hundreds of miles into the interior, their energy and rain sustaining life deep in the heart of the continent. Overhead, the air moved in patterns unique to a world with one vast landmass. Without multiple continents to break their paths, wind systems could travel immense distances. Dust from the central deserts might settle in the foothills here, while spores from coastal plants could drift farther inland than in any modern landscape. Every breeze was part of a planetary network, binding distant regions together in subtle, constant ways. As the seasons turned, these lands shifted in tone and texture. In the wet months, they were green and buzzing with life, the rivers swollen and the air rich with the smell of growing things. In the dry months, they baked under an unblinking sun, the ground cracking and the wind carrying whispers of the harsher core beyond. For the creatures of this place, adaptability was everything. They learned the rhythms of their world, the timing of the rains, the safe paths between feeding grounds, the signs of predators on the wind. Survival meant not just enduring the present, but anticipating the next change. This transitional realm between coast and desert was both a passageway and a home, a place where the movements of Pangea's life could be read like lines in the sand. Every footprint, every bent blade of grass, every ripple in the water told a fragment of the story, and all of it was part of the same unbroken land, a single stage on which the ancient drama of Earth played out without pause. The actors changing, but the ground beneath them remaining united in its vast, restless sweep. Beyond the open plains and transitional forests, the land began to rise again, not into gentle hills, but into jagged ridges and folded mountain belts, the ancient scars of Pangea's making. These were places where, millions of years earlier, continents had collided with irresistible force, shoving rock upward until it stood in great walls against the sky. Even now, long after their birth, the mountains carried the memory of violence in their crumpled strata, layers of stone twisted like fabric under unimaginable pressure. At their peaks, thin air carried a sharper chill, the sun's warmth blunted by elevation, and the wind roared through passes with a voice that seemed older than the land itself. The slopes were marked by contrasts. On one side, moisture-laden winds from distant coasts condensed into clouds, feeding forests that climbed high into the foothills. Moss draped the trunks, streams spilled in silver ribbons over ledges, and pockets of ferns huddled in the shade of towering conifers. On the other side, in the rain shadow, the land was stark and dry. Grasses clung in sparse tufts to rocky soil, and the ground was littered with weathered boulders that had tumbled from cliffs in ancient landslides. These mountains were more than a barrier. They were catalysts, redirecting air currents, trapping clouds, and creating the sharp boundaries between wet and dry regions that defined so much of Pangea's climate. In their high meadows, herds of herbivorous therapsids grazed on hardy plants that could survive short growing seasons. They moved slowly across the slopes, their thick limbs steady on the uneven ground. Some bore tusk-like projections used for digging at roots or stripping bark from conifers. Predators followed them here too, lean-bodied and strong-jawed creatures adapted to the thinner air, stalking silently along ridgelines or waiting near water sources fed by snowmelt. The mountains themselves were restless. Even in their apparent stillness, tectonic forces continue to push and strain beneath them. Occasionally, the ground shivered, sending small rockfalls tumbling into valleys. In some regions, volcanic activity still lingered. Cone-shaped peaks smoked faintly against the horizon, and the scent of sulphur drifted on the wind. When these volcanoes erupted, they transformed the world around them. Ash clouds could blot out the sun for days, cooling the air and blanketing the slopes in grey powder. In time, that ash would mix with soil, enriching it and encouraging new growth. But in the moment, it was a force that could choke rivers, bury plants, and drive animals from their ranges. The rivers that began in these mountains were the arteries of the land, carrying snowmelt and rainwater into the valleys below. Some wound their way toward the coasts, feeding the lush wetlands and forests at the edges of Pangea. Others disappeared into the interior, their flow dwindling as they crossed the dry heartlands until they sank into the earth or vanished into salt flats under the heat of the sun. Along their courses, life clustered in narrow ribbons of green. Plants took root in the damp soil, creating corridors where insects buzzed in thick clouds and amphibians lingered in shaded pools. Reptiles and therapsids followed these waterways, their movements synchronized with the seasonal rise and fall of the rivers. The sound of water in such vast, often dry lands was more than a comfort. It was a signal, drawing life from miles around. The valleys carved by these rivers were worlds of their own. In the wetter zones, forests crowded close to the banks, their canopies meeting overhead to form tunnels of green. In the drier stretches, the trees thinned, replaced by grasses and low shrubs. Yet the river's influence remained clear. Tracks of animals crisscrossed the mud, some fresh, others hardened into natural casts that would survive for weeks until the next flood erased them. In certain seasons, these valleys became migration routes. Herds moved along them, feeding on the plants that grew thickest near the water. Predators learned the patterns, waiting in the bends, where cover was plentiful. Birds, primitive ancestors of the forms we know today, followed the same paths, feeding on insects stirred up by the movement of larger animals. The connection between highland and lowland was constant. Nutrients washed down from the mountains in floods, settling into the floodplains and creating fertile soils that supported bursts of vegetation. In return, seeds from the valleys were carried upward by wind or in the guts of migrating animals, finding new ground in sheltered slopes or alpine meadows. Even in this deep time, the exchange between elevation and plain was shaping the spread of life across the continent. Above it all, the mountains stood as reminders of Pangea's restless heart. Their peaks caught the first light of dawn and held the last glow of sunset, their shadows stretching for miles into the lands below. In the dry season, they appeared almost barren from a distance, yet close up they revealed 1,000 hidden pockets of life. Mossy springs where amphibians bred, sun-warmed ledges where reptiles basked, and crevices where hardy plants anchored themselves against the wind. The creatures that lived here were specialists. Small, fleet-footed reptiles could dart across rock without losing their footing. Insects adapted to cooler temperatures swarmed in the brief warm hours of the afternoon. Larger predators, needing to conserve energy, patrolled well-worn routes that linked the most promising hunting grounds. For all its variety, life here existed in delicate balance. A single shift in climate, a longer dry season, a heavier snowfall, could tip the scales, forcing migrations or wiping out entire local populations. Yet this fragility was also a source of resilience. Species that survived in the mountains had already learned to adapt to extremes, to read the signs in the wind and the shape of the clouds, to move when movement meant survival. Standing among these ranges, with the wind cutting sharp against your skin and the horizon layered in shades of blue and grey, it would be easy to imagine the permanence of the scene. But the mountains themselves were temporary on the planet's time scale. Erosion was already at work, grinding peaks to rubble, carrying their remains to the lowlands in the endless cycle of stone. In another 100 million years, some of these ridges would be worn down to hills, their jagged edges smoothed, their height given back to the land from which it came. For now, though, they were sentinels over a supercontinent, marking the places where Pangea's bones had been fused together in fire and pressure. They were landmarks in a world without borders, points of orientation in a land so vast that distances lost their meaning. And they were, like every other part of this ancient earth, part of a single, connected whole, one continent, one sky, one restless story still unfolding. Descending from the high ridges into the lands beyond, the world of Pangea opened into vast plateaus and gently sloping basins, places where the memory of mountains lingered in the scattered boulders and ridgelines worn soft by time. The air here carried less of the sharp chill of elevation, replaced instead by a steady warmth that deepened as the seasons turned towards summer. This was not yet the scorched heart of the continent, but it was a step closer, a land where the rains came less often and the rivers ran slower, winding lazily through broad valleys before disappearing into the horizon. The soil, rich with minerals washed down from the mountains, supported a patchwork of life. In some regions, open woodlands spread across the plateau, their trees spaced widely enough that light reached the ground to feed carpets of hardy grasses and low shrubs. Cycads stood like ancient sculptures, their thick trunks crowned with stiff fronds that caught the wind and rattled softly in the dry air. Between them, seed ferns spread wide leaves toward the sun, their roots tapping into deeper moisture. In the wet season, these plants flourished, their colours deepening, their crowns heavy with new growth. In the dry months, they drew inward, conserving energy until the rains returned. The wildlife here lived by a similar rhythm. Herds of herbivorous synapsids moved across the land in loose formations, following invisible paths between foraging grounds and waterholes. Their barrel-shaped bodies swayed with each step, their heads dipping to tear mouthfuls of fibrous plants before lifting again to check the wind for the scent of predators. Among them, smaller reptiles and early mammal-like creatures foraged in the shade of trees, feeding on seeds, insects, or the tender shoots that sprouted after rare rains. Predators prowled these plateaus with patience rather than haste. The open terrain offered little cover, and a careless move could send potential prey scattering toward the safety of rocky outcrops or thicker vegetation. Sleek-bodied hunters kept low to the ground, their eyes fixed on the slow, steady approach rather than the sudden chase. Fossil evidence from similar environments suggests that some of these predators may have hunted cooperatively, loosely shadowing one another as they steered herds toward ambush points. The rivers and seasonal streams shaped the patterns of life more than anything else. During the rains, they swelled beyond their banks, flooding low-lying meadows and leaving behind a patchwork of shallow pools. Fish and amphibians bred in the still waters, insects swarmed above them, and the land seemed to hum with activity. For weeks, the abundance drew animals from miles around, filling the valleys with movement. But as the water retreated, so too did much of the life. Pools dried into cracked mud, the fish gone, the insects reduced to a fraction of their numbers. Those that remained adapted to scarcity, burrowing into damp soil, slowing their metabolism, or travelling in search of more reliable sources. It was a landscape in constant negotiation with time, where survival meant anticipating change before it arrived. The sky over these plateaus seemed impossibly wide, a dome of shifting blues by day, and a sweep of cold, glittering stars by night. Clouds often built on the horizon, their shapes torn apart by winds before they could bring rain. When storms did break through, they swept in with sudden force, gusts bending the trees, rain pelting the ground in hard slanting lines, lightning cracking against the empty spaces between ridges. The smell of wet earth was intoxicating after long weeks of dryness, and the land responded almost instantly. Grasses sending up new shoots, flowers blooming in colours that seemed almost defiant against the muted backdrop. Along the edges of the plateaus, where the land began to slope downward into the low basins, life shifted again. Here the soil was heavier, holding more of the moisture from seasonal rains. Wetlands formed in shallow depressions, attracting flocks of primitive bird-like reptiles that fed on fish and insects in the shallows. Frogs and salamander-like amphibians thrived here, their calls rising into a chorus at dusk. These wetlands were crucial waypoints for migrating herds and travelling predators alike, offering water and food in an otherwise challenging environment. The air buzzed with insects in the warmer months, some large enough that their wing beats were audible as they passed. Dragonflies, descendants of giants from earlier ages, hovered over the water, their compound eyes reflecting the shifting light. Predatory fish lurked below, snapping at anything that touched the surface. Along the muddy banks, the tracks of reptiles, therapsids, and smaller creatures crisscrossed in a dense tapestry of movement, each print telling a story of arrival, survival, or departure. As the season turned and the wetlands shrank, their importance only grew. Animals lingered longer at the remaining pools, tensions rising as space and resources narrowed. Predators took advantage of the concentration of prey, and sudden chases broke the otherwise still air. Those who could move on began their journeys toward more hospitable regions. Those who could not adapted to the changing waterline, surviving on whatever the shrinking ecosystem could offer. The interconnectedness of these plateaus, rivers, and wetlands was part of a larger pattern that defined Pangea. Without oceans to separate habitats, species could travel immense distances, spreading traits and adaptations across the continent. A predator evolved in the wetter uplands could, over generations, follow prey into drier plateaus, its descendants gradually adjusting to new conditions. Likewise, plants carried by wind, water, or migrating animals could establish themselves far from their original range, knitting together ecosystems that might otherwise have remained isolated. This fluidity meant that the boundaries between environments were often blurred, more a matter of gradual transition than sharp division. Standing on one of these plateaus and looking toward the distant haze, you could see the faint outline of higher mountains to one side, and the gradual descent toward the lowland deserts on the other. Between them lay everything: woodland, grassland, wetland, and dry steppe, stitched together into one continuous expanse. The animals that lived here knew the land as a whole, not as isolated pieces. Their movements followed the logic of seasons, water, and wind rather than the borders we imagine today. In the evenings, when the heat bled out of the ground and the first cool breezes moved across the plateau, the land seemed to exhale. The sky shifted to a wash of amber and violet, shadows lengthening until they merged with the darkness. In that moment between light and night, the activity surged. Predators set out under cover of dusk, herbivores moved to water with less risk, and insects filled the air with a steady drone. Far above, the stars appeared one by one, their light undimmed by any trace of human habitation. It was a reminder that this was a world not yet divided, its landmass whole beneath a single sky, its life bound together by the same winds and the same restless pulse of the earth. Every movement, every adaptation, every struggle for survival was part of that singular, immense experiment called Pangea, a stage so vast that it redefined what it meant to live on land. As the plateaus began to fall away into the lower reaches of Pangea's great interior, the land slowly hardened underfoot. The grasses thinned, the scattered shrubs grew tougher and more angular, and the spaces between them filled with bare ground and patches of coarse gravel. The air here felt heavier, as though the heat itself carried weight, pressing down on the shoulders and rising in waves from the baked earth. This was the beginning of the dry heart of the continent, a place where the sea's influence was a distant memory, and the sky seemed too large for the land beneath it. Water did not vanish entirely, but it became something sought rather than expected. Seasonal rivers still cut shallow channels across the landscape, but for much of the year they lay empty. The sand and silt at their bottoms cracked into intricate patterns by the sun. When rain came, often in sudden and violent storms, these channels transformed into racing torrents that scoured their beds clean, sweeping away whatever had gathered in the dry months. In the aftermath, they left behind pools that shone under the sun, temporary mirrors that drew life from every direction. Around these pools, plants and animals converged in fleeting abundance. Hardy cycads and low conifers spread roots deep into the moist soil, their green crowns standing out sharply against the muted palette of stone and dust. Herbivores came in cautious groups, drinking quickly before retreating to safer distances. Predators lurked at the edges, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving energy for the single burst that could mean the difference between feast and famine. Away from the water, life clung to niches carved by adaptation. Reptiles with scales like burnished armour used the heat to their advantage, basking on sun-warmed rocks before slipping into the shade to avoid overheating. Small mammal-like creatures emerged in the cooler hours, foraging for seeds or insects with quick, nervous movements. Some burrowed deep into the ground, their tunnels holding the cool air and sheltering them from predators and the relentless midday sun. The wind carried dust from far-off deserts, coating leaves, filling the cracks in rocks, and tracing shifting patterns across the open flats. It also brought subtle changes in temperature and scent, signals that the creatures here could read as easily as we read the sky. A sudden cool breeze could mean a storm was building days away. A faint, dry heat could warn of a long period without rain. The vast openness of the interior bred a kind of stillness that was never truly silent. The air hummed with the sound of insects, the distant cry of some unseen reptile, the whisper of sand grains tumbling against each other. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, and the land came alive in a different way. Under the cold starlight, predators prowled with renewed energy, their eyes catching the faint glint of the moon. Herbivores moved more freely, grazing without the weight of the sun's heat, though always aware that danger could come from the darkness as easily as from the day. Fossils from similar ancient environments show a mix of footprints, large three-toed impressions left by early archosaurs alongside smaller, more delicate prints from agile foragers. These overlapping traces suggest a constant negotiation for space and resources, an unending test of endurance, where the balance could shift with a single season's change. In some parts of the interior, the land rose again in low ridges, remnants of far older geological upheavals. These heights caught what little rainfall passed through, their slopes supporting slightly denser vegetation than the surrounding flats. Such ridges became crucial landmarks, guiding the movements of migrating herds and serving as vantage points for predators scanning the horizon. In the hollows between them, shade lingered longer, moisture clung to the soil, and life gathered in quiet, temporary abundance. The plants of this region bore the marks of long adaptation to dryness. Leaves were narrow or tough-skinned to reduce water loss. Roots reached deep or spread wide to gather whatever moisture the soil could offer. Some bore seeds encased in protective shells, capable of lying dormant through years of unfavourable conditions before sprouting in the wake of a rare, heavy rain. Insects fed on the nectar of the few flowering species, and in turn they became a vital food source for the small reptiles and synapsids that hunted them. Here and there, bones lay half buried in the dust, sun-bleached reminders of those who had failed to find the balance between need and endurance. The wind moved them slowly over time, erasing the sharp edges until they became part of the land itself. These remains fed the soil with minerals, and in that way even death contributed to the cycles that sustained life. Despite the harshness, the interior was not without beauty. At sunrise, the land blushed in soft pinks and golds, the first light spilling over ridges and pooling in the shallow valleys. Shadows stretched long and thin, and for a brief hour, the air held a coolness that made every breath feel easier. At sunset, the sky often ignited in shades of copper and crimson, the heat of the day dissolving into a stillness broken only by the slow rustle of creatures beginning their night's work. Above, the stars seemed sharper here than anywhere else, their light unbroken by haze or cloud, as if the universe leaned a little closer to this lonely stretch of land. The creatures that called this place home were shaped by its extremes. They learned to move with the patterns of light and dark, to find shelter before the sun reached its peak, to travel far when the promise of water lay beyond the horizon. Over generations, these adaptations became instinct, carried forward in the silent knowledge of survival. And yet, even in such a demanding environment, life found ways to thrive. Seeds waited beneath the surface for the signal of rain. Predators honed their patience, and the herds traced paths worn into the earth by countless ancestors. In this vast, unbroken expanse, every footprint, every ripple of movement in the grass, every shadow cast under the high sun, was part of a story millions of years in the making. A story written not in words, but in the quiet persistence of life against the odds. And as the dry heart of Pangea stretched onward, it hinted at what lay deeper still within the continent, regions where even these signs of abundance would fade, giving way to deserts so expansive that they seemed less a part of the earth than an endless shifting sea of sand beneath a boundless, blazing sky. The transition from the arid interior to the true deserts of Pangea was not sudden, but it was unmistakable. The ground grew paler, the vegetation sparser, until the last patches of grass clung only to the edges of shallow wadis, dry riverbeds carved long ago by waters that no longer came. The wind began to take on a sharper voice here, whistling across open expanses and driving fine grains of sand into every crevice of stone. Beneath the relentless sun, the air shimmered, bending the horizon into wavering shapes that vanished as you drew closer. This was the desert heartland, a realm where the scarcity of life made every sign of it feel like a rare discovery. The surface of the land shifted constantly. Dunes rose and fell with the seasons, their crests shaped by prevailing winds into knife-edged ridges. Between them lay flat, hard pans of salt and clay, gleaming white under the noonlight. These pans bore the marks of ancient lakes, their cracked surfaces telling of times when rain was more generous, when rivers still fed inland basins before retreating toward the coasts. Now they were silent, save for the occasional hiss of sand skittering across them. Life here existed on the edge of invisibility. Many creatures emerged only in the cooler hours, leaving delicate tracks across the sand that the wind would erase by morning. Small reptiles with pale, heat-reflecting scales darted between burrows, their bodies built for conserving water and shedding excess heat. Insects were scarce but resourceful. Beetles that could harvest moisture from the morning dew, ants that travelled in disciplined lines to scavenged remains, flies that appeared suddenly after rare rains to breed and vanish within days. Larger animals moved through these deserts with measured care. Some were nomadic, travelling vast distances in search of waterholes that might hold for a few weeks before drying to dust. Others remained near the few permanent oases, places where underground springs fed small clusters of hardy vegetation, acacias with deep roots, palms that cast narrow strips of shade, reeds that whispered in the faint breeze. These oases were magnets for life, drawing everything from herds of herbivorous synapsids to predatory archosaurs that would wait in the shadows, their bodies still as carved stone until the moment to strike arrived. Rain was an event so rare it could redefine the land in hours. Storms gathered far to the west or east, driven across the supercontinent by unpredictable winds. When they broke over the desert, the impact was dramatic. Sheets of rain hammering the sand, gullies roaring with sudden torrents, dunes collapsing into muddy flows. Seeds that had lain dormant for years burst into life almost overnight, carpeting the flats with green shoots and small flowers whose colours seemed almost unreal against the usual monotone. For a brief season, the desert transformed into a place of abundance, its hidden potential released in a frenzy of growth and reproduction. Animals moved quickly to take advantage of the change, grazers feeding on the tender plants, predators finding prey more easily as the land concentrated movement toward water and forage. But just as quickly, the transformation would fade. The sun reclaimed the moisture, plants withered, and the desert returned to its quiet endurance. Fossilized evidence suggests that some of these regions once supported larger, more permanent lakes during wetter climatic cycles, and that the desert itself may have expanded and contracted repeatedly over millions of years. That cycle of advance and retreat left layers of history beneath the sand, ancient shorelines, buried river channels, and the remains of creatures that once roamed here when the climate was softer. Standing on the edge of a vast dune field, it was easy to imagine the desert as unchanging. But beneath its surface, the earth was always moving. Wind sculpted new patterns each day. Sand buried the traces of what had passed, and the shifting landscape concealed as much as it revealed. The heat could feel absolute here, a weight that pressed down from above and radiated upward from the ground. Shadows were scarce and precious, claimed quickly by any creature lucky enough to find them. The air was so dry that sound carried strangely far. A distant call, the scrape of claws against stone, the flutter of wings, each detail standing out against the otherwise heavy silence. Nights were a reversal. The heat bled away into the open sky, the sand cooling until it held the chill of stone. Under the sweep of countless stars, the desert took on a different kind of life. Nocturnal predators hunted with quiet precision, their movements leaving faint trails in the moonlit dust. Small creatures emerged to forage, their eyes catching the pale light. Their bodies adapted to find food and water in ways almost invisible to human senses. The constellations overhead were the same ones that would one day be named by civilizations far in the future. But here, in this ancient time, they shone over a land still ruled entirely by the raw terms of survival. Despite its apparent emptiness, the desert was deeply connected to the rest of Pangea. Winds carried dust from its heart to far-off forests and wetlands, spreading minerals that enriched distant soils. Migrating animals moved between the desert's edges and more forgiving regions, carrying seeds in their fur, spores on their skin, and nutrients in their waste. Even the rare storms that crossed the dunes often began as moisture gathered over oceans thousands of miles away, linking the most arid stretches of land to the most distant shores. For those who endured here, the desert demanded a kind of knowledge that could not be learned quickly, a reading of subtle signs, a patience that measured time in seasons and cycles rather than days. Every dune crest, every dry channel, every shifting shadow was part of a map, written by the land itself, guiding life toward survival in one of Earth's most unforgiving realms. And yet, in its austerity, there was a stark beauty, a reminder that, even in scarcity, life found a way to persist, adapting not in spite of the desert's challenges, but because of them. The air itself was part of Pangea's story, a living medium that carried memory across the continent and pressed its weight into every landscape, from reefed coasts to empty dunes. To breathe here was to take in a sky shaped by fire and forest, by mountains that redirected winds and seas that warmed the edges of land before surrendering to the cool reach of night. In earlier ages, leading toward the height of Pangea, oxygen had risen well above what we know today, and the world answered by enlarging the small. Insects, whose bodies draw air through tiny openings rather than lungs, grew into improbable sizes under richer oxygen. You could imagine dragonflies crossing sunlit clearings with wings broader than a human arm, steady and unhurried, their flight an echo of air chemistry, as much as muscle and nerve. But Pangea did not hold its breath at one level for long. As the supercontinent matured into the Permian and beyond, oxygen slipped downward again, forcing the living to adjust. The oversized arthropods declined. Creatures with more efficient lungs and hearts, therapsids among them, gained an advantage, their bodies fine-tuned to pull what they needed from thinner air. The shift did not happen in a year or even in 1,000, but across spans so long that adaptation felt like inheritance rather than change. If oxygen sketched the limits of size and speed, carbon dioxide wrote the climate's mood line by line. Volcanoes, along sutures where the continent had fused, breathed CO2 into the sky, a greenhouse gas that trapped heat the way a blanket holds the body's warmth. The effects were uneven, as all weather is. Coasts stayed humid and lush, deserts baked harder, and seasonal contrasts sharpened where distance from the sea grew extreme. After powerful eruptions, the air sometimes filled with fine particles, what we'd now call aerosols, that scattered sunlight and briefly cooled the surface, reddening sunsets over forests and sending a pale veil across morning light in the interior. Each burst of ash was both shock and gift. Shock in the dimming, the chill nights, the burden on lungs, gift in the minerals that later fed soils when rain carried the ash into valleys and flats. Wind was the continent's great courier. With no chain of separate land masses to break its stride, the atmosphere moved in vast, simple patterns, sweeping from tropics toward poles and back again, reversing with the seasons where heat shifts pulled the engine of circulation the other way. In some regions, a monsoon formed, the word simply a seasonal wind that changes direction, drawing moist air inland for weeks at a time, then retreating and leaving clear, dry skies. On Pangea, the scale was grand. When the ocean's breath surged toward the land, forests at the edges darkened in sudden rain, and rivers lifted a note in their voices. When the winds swung away, the sky went high and empty, and the land leaned back into its long, dry patience. Dust made the journey as well, a fine cargo loaded in the desert's hands and delivered to forests 1,000 miles away. It fell as a film on conifer needles, washed into soil by the first soft rain, and entered the roots of seed ferns and cycads that built the low canopy beneath taller trees. The desert, in this way, fed the rainforest, and the rainforest returned the favour by sending oxygen into the air and plant fragments downstream to the coasts. The continent was singular, not only in rock but in exchange. What began as wind-borne grit ended as green, and what grew in shade returned as breath to the creatures that lived in sun. You could feel the atmosphere's reach in small places. In a dim river corridor, cut through conifer uplands, the air under the canopy was humid and resin-scented, cool on skin even when the sky beyond the trees flared white with noon. Step out onto a basalt outcrop above the same valley, and a loop of hot wind would meet you, lifting dust, drying the mouth, pushing the scent of sap back into the trees. At dusk, temperature slipped and the breeze softened, smelling of wet earth where streams pooled in the bends, and always far overhead, thin clouds moved on long, unbroken tracks, as if the sky were remembering routes it had taken for millions of years. Animals were written into these patterns. Reptiles of the open country regulated heat by routine, a morning bask to raise their blood, then the long drift into shadow when the ground turned fierce. Therapsids with deeper chests and more complex jaws, signs of stronger breathing and energetic feeding, pushed farther into regions where oxygen had ebbed, their bodies budgeting heat and water with care. Even behaviour showed the atmosphere's hand. On nights after hot days, predators ranged farther. On days following cool, ash-hazed sunsets, herbivores lingered longer to feed. Where the air held more moisture, calls carried short and thick. On the dry flats, a cry could travel improbable distances, a warning sent across ground that gave up no other cover. Plants had their own dialogue with the sky, one breath traded for another. Leaves opened tiny pores to draw in carbon dioxide for building sugar, closing them again to hold water when air went dry and hot. Conifers kept needles that lost little moisture, trading speed of growth for endurance. Seed ferns spread broad fronds where humidity allowed, pulling more gas when the air carried it, then trimming their appetite when seasons thinned the supply. In wet belts, forests grew dense enough to make their own weather, transpiring moisture into air that rose and cooled and fell again as mist. Along margins where rains failed more often, shrubs hunkered low, their waxed skins shining under hard light, each pore guarded like a gate. Sky colour told the day's story in a language anyone could learn with time. After weeks of clear weather, dawns came up pale, almost metallic, then warmed quickly to a flat, bright blue. Before a monsoon burst, the horizon gathered a bruise, purple low under white towers that swelled until they met above the land, the first gust advancing like a cold hand over the grass. After volcanic ash drifted high, sunsets burned longer, the orange banded with crimson, and rose until darkness snapped down with the suddenness of a door. Stars then answered in impossible numbers, the Milky Way cast like frost across black, and the air felt thin and exact, every sound carved and separate. The atmosphere shaped time as much as space. Wet seasons compressed abundance into short windows. Dry seasons stretched endurance into art. Seeds slept through years until a storm strong enough to wake them passed. Insects matched their hatching to heat and dew, surfacing for a dawn and vanishing by dusk. Rivers rose in pulses, laying down silt like pages in a ledger, where future roots could read what the sky had written. The old cycles returned, but never perfectly. Each turn brought some small difference, and over distances only the earth counts. Those differences added to new forms, new habits, new answers to the same hard questions of light and water and air. If you stood on a ridge above plains of open woodland and waited for the evening wind, you could measure the continent with your skin. Warmth from the day's baked ground lifted first, then a breath from far away slipped over it, cooler, salted faintly by the memory of sea, though the coast lay beyond sight. It touched your face, went on into the trees, and out over a line of river light that was already loosening into night. Pangea's air had crossed deserts and mountains to find you. It had gathered dust and rain, ash and leaf scent, heat and the cold note of distant ice. It was one atmosphere over one continent, and everything living beneath it was tuned to its reach. In that simple unity lay the logic of the age, a world held together by sky, changed by it, and preparing, in ways no creature could sense, for the day when the same winds would begin to part the land they had bound. From the high air and the wide desert interiors, the land began to lean downward toward the long lines of Pangea's coasts, where the supercontinent met the restless skin of its surrounding ocean. Here, the air shifted character, still warm in the low latitudes but weighted with salt, carrying the damp breath of waves that had travelled unbroken for thousands of miles before meeting the continent's edge. The transition was subtle at first, felt in the softening of the light, the way the wind gained a rolling rhythm, and in the gradual appearance of vegetation more tolerant of spray and shifting sand. As the ground descended, the inland scrub gave way to denser stands of trees, their roots binding dunes and headlands against the constant shaping of tide and storm. Pangea's coasts were varied and vast. In some places they were wide, low plains, where the sea crept inland over mudflats and salt marshes, leaving ribbons of shallow water where fish and invertebrates thrived. In others, cliffs dropped directly into deep water, the rock dark and sheer, carved by waves into arches and caves that became shelter for seabirds and resting points for marine reptiles. Where rivers met the sea, deltas spread like open hands, their fingers of sediment carrying the memory of entire watersheds into the shallows. These estuaries were alive with life from both worlds, freshwater fish nosing into brackish channels, crabs scuttling over silt, and amphibians that used the margins as breeding grounds in the calm seasons. The tides themselves were a kind of clock, pulling the water back to reveal stretches of sand and rock before returning to cover them again. In the exposed hours, the intertidal zone came alive. Barnacles closed tight against drying air. Mollusks buried themselves deeper into sand, and tide pools became miniature worlds of anemones, algae, and darting fish trapped for a few cycles before the next flood. These narrow bands of life felt delicate, yet they were shaped for endurance. Their inhabitants adapted to the daily swing between immersion and exposure. The rhythm had been the same long before Pangea's full form, and it would continue long after the supercontinent broke apart. Farther offshore, reefs flourished in clear, shallow waters. Ancient relatives of corals built structures that rose toward the sunlight, their skeletons layered over generations into sprawling living fortresses. Around them, shoals of fish moved in shifting clouds, each turn flashing silver before vanishing into shadow again. Larger hunters patrolled the open spaces between reef and shore, sleek, fast-moving predators whose bodies were honed by the demands of the chase, and slower, armoured forms that relied on bulk and defence rather than speed. Marine reptiles, some with paddle-like limbs and long jaws filled with teeth, cruised between the zones, equally at home in open water or skimming the edges of coastal shallows in search of prey. Storms at sea could change a coastline overnight. With no human eyes to measure them, they came without warning, great walls of cloud pushing ahead of themselves, the heave of dark water. Waves struck cliffs until their faces crumbled, rolled boulders into new resting places, and shifted entire bars of sand so that channels closed and new ones opened. In low-lying areas, salt water surged far inland, leaving behind a crust of salt and the wreckage of uprooted plants. Yet in time the coast recovered. Plants regrew, sand settled, and the living web of reef and marsh and dune adapted to the new shape, just as it had countless times before. The coasts were also places of passage. For some creatures, they were breeding grounds, marine reptiles crawling ashore to lay eggs above the tide line, shorebirds nesting in the safety of isolated spits, amphibians returning to brackish pools where they themselves had first hatched. For others, the edge of the continent was simply a crossing point, herds of animals following seasonal paths that brought them to drink from freshwater pools near the shore before turning back inland, or migrating species that moved along the beaches as part of a larger route spanning hundreds of miles. Plant life along these margins often carried the hallmarks of resilience. Salt-tolerant shrubs grew low and dense, their leaves thick and waxy to resist drying winds. Grasses anchored dunes, their long roots holding the sand against erosion. In some places, forests of tall conifers stood close to the water, their trunks silvered by salt spray, needles hissing softly in the breeze. The mix of plant and animal life made the coast some of the most dynamic and densely inhabited zones of Pangea, even when compared to the richest inland forests. From a high headland, you could watch the meeting of land and sea in endless motion, the hiss of foam on stone, the cry of seabirds wheeling above dark water, the slow tilt of light as clouds drifted across the sun, all of it folded into a rhythm older than the continents themselves. Each tide erased footprints from the sand, but the patterns of life remained, etched deeper than any single trace. Here, where the supercontinent met the ocean, the scale of Pangea felt most tangible. One line of coast stretching for thousands of miles in either direction, unbroken by any great sea or neighbouring landmass, its every curve and cliff facing outward toward the same vast horizon. And yet, even here at the edge, the land bore the marks of forces already working to unmake it. Beneath the waves, the slow drift of tectonic plates was beginning to open new rifts, to thin the crust where oceans would someday form. The future lay hidden in the seabed's subtle tremors and in the faint pull of currents, finding new paths. For now, though, the coast held steady, a living boundary where the heartbeat of the land met the pulse of the sea, a meeting that would shape the life and climate of the supercontinent for millions of years to come. Beyond the reach of the breaking waves, where the shallow light blue waters darkened into deep green, and then into the shadowed blue of the open sea, Pangea's oceans stretched unbroken for distances the mind could barely hold. Here, the land was only a distant memory, a low smudge on the horizon, if visible at all, and the world belonged entirely to the currents and the creatures they carried. The surface was never still. Even on calm days it moved with a slow, deliberate heave, the long swell of distant winds that had stirred the water hundreds of miles away. Beneath, the sea was layered, warm, light-filled shallows on top, cooler, darker waters below, each stratum home to its own forms of life. In the upper zone, sunlight streamed down in wavering beams, caught and scattered by plankton that bloomed in great clouds. These microscopic plants and animals were the ocean's quiet engine, feeding on light and nutrients, multiplying in staggering numbers, and in turn becoming food for small fish and drifting filter feeders. Shoals of silver-bodied fish moved through them like shifting mirrors, their scales flashing in the light before disappearing into the dimmer depths. Larger hunters prowled here too, swift predators with sleek bodies built for sudden bursts of speed, jaws snapping through schools in a flurry of motion before vanishing into the blue. Farther down, where light weakened to a faint green haze, the shapes of life became stranger. Slow-moving fish with broad fins hovered motionless, conserving energy in the cooler water. Long-bodied reptiles dove here to hunt, their eyes adapted to the dimness, their bodies capable of holding breath for extended chases. Jellies pulsed in slow rhythm, their translucent bells catching what little light remained, their tentacles trailing like drifting threads. The water was quieter here, sound travelling differently in the dense medium, low clicks, pulses and vibrations carrying messages between creatures far out of sight of one another. Storms above could reach deep into this world. When the wind whipped the surface into white caps and rain hammered down, the energy stirred the upper layers, mixing warmth and nutrients, driving plankton blooms that would later feed entire chains of life. Waves could roll for days across these expanses, their motion felt far below the surface, flexing the bodies of kelp-like algae that anchored to the seafloor in shallower stretches. Where volcanic islands rose along Pangea's coasts or in offshore arcs, lava met seawater in bursts of steam and shattered stone, creating new land that life would colonize within years. Around these islands, the surrounding seas were often rich with nutrients, supporting dense populations of fish, seabirds, and marine reptiles. The open ocean was not empty. It was a moving, breathing system, driven by currents that linked distant coasts in slow looping circuits. Warm water travelled from the tropics toward higher latitudes, where it cooled and sank, returning along the deep paths in the opposite direction. These great conveyor belts carried more than heat. They transported life, seeds of coral drifting in larval form, spores from coastal plants, and the eggs of fish and invertebrates that would hatch far from where they began. The ocean's surface could seem featureless, but beneath it ran invisible roads, highways of temperature and flow that guided migration and shaped survival. Some creatures were travellers on these roads. Large marine reptiles undertook journeys across entire basins, following prey or breeding cycles, their paths perhaps inherited through instinct older than memory. Others drifted wherever the currents took them, living out their entire existence in the wandering gyres where floating debris, bits of plant matter, shells, and the occasional pumice from distant eruptions formed temporary rafts. Small fish sheltered in the shadow of this drifting flotsam, feeding on the organisms that colonised it, and larger predators circled, waiting for a chance to strike. In the deeper reaches, beyond the last touch of sunlight, the sea belonged to creatures adapted to a world of cold and pressure. Some produced their own light in patterns and flashes, drawing prey close or signalling to mates in the dark. Others moved with slow, deliberate motions, conserving every bit of energy, feeding on the rain of organic material that sank from the brighter layers above. This marine snow fell constantly, tiny fragments of dead plankton, fecal pellets, bits of plant and shell, linking the lives of the surface to the hidden depths. Pangea's deep sea also hid its own forms of heat and light. Along mid-ocean ridges where the crust was pulling apart, seawater seeped into cracks, was superheated by magma, and burst back into the ocean through vents in billowing plumes. Around these hydrothermal vents, mineral-rich water supported communities that owed nothing to sunlight, drawing energy instead from the chemistry of the earth itself. Tube worms with bright red plumes, ghostly white crabs, and dense mats of bacteria thrived in an oasis of life surrounded by darkness. These vent systems were scattered, but they offered proof that life could flourish in conditions far removed from the familiar balance of sun, air, and surface. The open sea influenced the land in return. Storms that built over warm water carried their moisture toward Pangea's coasts, feeding the monsoons and seasonal rains that sustained forests and rivers. Currents redistributed heat, softening the extremes of climate along the supercontinent's edges and sharpening them inland where the moderating influence of the ocean could not reach. Migrating marine creatures brought nutrients ashore when they bred or died, their bodies feeding scavengers and enriching the soil. Even the faint haze over Pangea's deserts sometimes began here, dusting the waves with minerals that were later lifted into the air and carried deep into the interior. From the deck of an imagined driftwood raft, the scale of this waterworld would have been overwhelming. Days could pass with no sign of land, the horizon a perfect curve in all directions, the sky and sea meeting in a seam that shifted only with light and weather. Sunrise broke in a blaze of copper and gold, painting the water's skin before the colour drained upward into the high blue of day. Sunset reversed the process, the sea catching fire again before surrendering to the deep, cool silver of starlight. At night, the ocean's surface sometimes glowed faintly with bioluminescent plankton, each disturbance sparking a brief trail of light, a living reflection of the stars overhead. In this vastness, the story of Pangea was as much water as it was stone. The oceans fed its edges, shaped its climate, and carried the seeds of life across distances greater than any single creature could travel alone. And even here, far from land, the slow work of change was underway. Tectonic forces deep beneath the waves were already straining at the bonds that held the supercontinent whole, preparing in silence for a breaking that would scatter its coasts into the world we now know. Beneath the floor of Pangea's surrounding oceans, forces older than the continent itself moved with unhurried certainty. The crust here was not fixed stone, but a shifting mosaic of plates, each carried on the slow currents of the mantle far below. Along certain hidden lines, these plates were pulling apart, letting molten rock rise into the void and harden into new seafloor. The process was invisible from the surface, yet it was ceaseless, building ridges that wound for thousands of miles beneath the waves. In the dim light of these depths, the newly formed rock was still warm, its cracks venting mineral-rich water into the surrounding sea. Life had already claimed it, colonies of microbes clinging to the stone, feeding on the heat-borne chemistry as if it were sunlight. Over time, these narrow ridges would push the ocean basins wider, changing the balance between water and land. The movement of the crust did not announce itself in sudden drama. Instead, it worked like the slow tightening of a rope, strain building over millions of years. Yet even in the present moment of Pangea's unity, the first signs of separation were taking shape. Along certain coastal zones, rift valleys deepened where the land was stretching and thinning. Faults marked the surface like faint scars, guiding rivers and shaping inlets. Magma pooled beneath these zones, and when pressure found a weakness, volcanic islands rose offshore in bursts of fire and steam. These new lands cooled under the ocean winds, their flanks colonized by ferns and conifers within decades, their slopes home to seabirds and reptiles that nested above the tide line. Inland, the same tectonic restlessness had its own expressions. Mountain ranges that once marked the collision of ancient continents were eroding under the weight of time, but in other regions, the crust was still crumpling upward, building new heights. Earthquakes rolled through these zones, sending rockfalls into valleys and briefly muddying rivers with silt. Lakes formed where land sagged along faults, trapping water in basins that became rich habitats for fish, amphibians, and the plants that lined their shores. In places, volcanic ash drifted down in fine layers, settling over forests and floodplains before being folded into the soil, feeding new growth even as it buried the old. The cycle of building and breaking was not limited to rock. As the land shifted, so too did the paths of rivers, the shapes of coasts, the climates of entire regions. A rising mountain range could steal rain from one side of the land, leaving it to wither into desert while the opposite slope grew lush and wet. A new valley could collect water that once flowed to the sea, turning grassland into marsh. These changes rippled outward through the living world, altering migration routes, reshaping plant communities, and forcing animals to adapt or vanish. In Pangea's unity, there was still a constant undercurrent of change, each adjustment preparing the stage for the greater transformation to come. Yet on the surface, to a creature walking the land or swimming the sea, this slow-motion unmaking would have been invisible, except in moments of rare violence. A sudden earthquake could split a cliffside, sending part of it into the ocean, with a crash that sent waves racing toward distant shores. A volcanic eruption could darken the sky for weeks, ash falling like strange snow across forests and deserts alike. These were reminders that the ground itself was alive with motion, and that permanence was an illusion of time's short view. Geologists, looking back from the far future, would see the signs clearly: the alignment of volcanic chains, the age patterns in seafloor rock, the shapes of fault-bounded basins. But here, in the age of Pangea, these were simply elements of the background, features folded into the continent's identity. The living world responded without understanding, adjusting instinctively to the rearrangements of coast and climate. Plants colonized new volcanic slopes, animals followed new rivers, reefs built themselves along fresh shorelines, and in the quiet spaces between events, life went on as it always had, bound to the land even as the land began to loosen its bonds to itself. From a high plateau inland, you might never sense the ocean's slow widening. The ground underfoot would feel solid, the mountains fixed against the sky, the rivers cutting the same paths they had for generations. And yet, in the deep bedrock far beneath, fractures were lengthening, heat was pooling, and the earliest whispers of continental drift were already shaping the planet's next chapter. Millions of years in the future, these forces would pull Pangea apart into pieces that would drift to the positions we know today, pieces that would carry with them the fossils, soils, and living descendants of this age. But for now, the supercontinent held together, its unity masking the quiet work of separation already underway. On the coasts where rifting had begun, the signs were more tangible. Bays deepened into long inlets, cliffs sheared away to reveal fresh rock, and new islands appeared offshore like stepping stones into the sea. The water around these islands teemed with life, enriched by minerals from undersea vents and volcanic slopes. Here the meeting of land and ocean was not just a boundary, but a place of renewal, where the Earth's restlessness created habitats as quickly as it destroyed them. From the air, if one could imagine that distant view, the coastlines here would look ragged, scalloped by the beginnings of a process that, given enough time, would draw whole oceans between the fragments of the once whole land. And yet, for all the tectonic tension, Pangea still gave the impression of immensity and stability. To stand at the heart of it was to feel surrounded by an unbroken horizon of land, the sea impossibly far away, the mountains rising like anchors to the sky. The thought that this vastness could ever be divided would have seemed absurd to any witness of its present state. But the Earth's history is not one of stillness, and the great experiment of a single world continent was already entering its last long act, unseen beneath the surfaces of stone and water. Across the vast surface of Pangea, the climate was a tapestry woven from extremes. At its heart, far from the tempering breath of the sea, the air turned dry beneath a relentless sun. Deserts sprawled for thousands of miles, their sand seas broken only by rocky plateaus, and the occasional ribbon of green along rare rivers. Here, the days could burn under a sky bleached pale, and the nights could cool so sharply that the heat seemed a dream. Winds carried dust in long, shimmering veils, depositing it in low basins where it lay in soft layers, ready to shift again with the next season's storms. The dryness was more than a feature of place, it was a symptom of Pangea's immensity. The continent's interior was simply too far from any ocean to draw steady rain, leaving life to cling where it could along scattered watercourses and deep-rooted oases. Toward the coasts, the air softened. Ocean currents brought moisture to the margins, feeding forests and wetlands that could not survive inland. Monsoonal patterns developed along certain shores, where heat built over the land during long summers and drew in moist air from the sea. These seasonal rains fell with force, flooding lowlands, recharging rivers, and turning plains briefly green, before retreating again into the dry season. In the tropics, rainforests thrived year-round, their canopies dense enough to shade the ground in perpetual twilight. Here, the air was thick with the scent of flowering plants and the constant hum of insects, and the life supported by these forests spilled into rivers and estuaries, linking the land's richness to the ocean's edge. At higher latitudes, Pangea's climate shifted into cooler patterns, with temperate forests of conifers and ginkgos stretching across rolling hills and broad valleys. These zones experienced true seasons, with summers mild and bright, and winters cold enough to still rivers and coat the ground in frost. Farther still toward the poles, tundra, and seasonal ice appeared, though without the vast glaciers that would one day dominate future ice ages. Here, plant life grew low and sparse, adapted to brief summers and long, dim winters. The animals of these regions migrated widely, following food sources that shifted with the seasons, moving inland and seaward in cycles as old as the continent itself. The climate of Pangea was not static. Changes in ocean circulation, in the tilt of the planet's axis, and in volcanic activity all conspired to alter patterns of wind and rain. Some shifts were gradual, unfolding over centuries, while others came abruptly. Droughts that withered grasslands, sudden cooling periods that shortened growing seasons, intervals of intense heat that dried lakes and drove animals to new ranges. Volcanic eruptions could loft ash high into the atmosphere, dimming the sun for months and lowering temperatures far from the eruption site. These changes rippled through ecosystems, forcing species to adapt in place, move to new territories, or face decline. The very unity of Pangea intensified these shifts. With so much landmass joined together, the interior reacted strongly to any alteration in global climate. A slight change in wind direction could mean the difference between seasonal rain and prolonged drought across thousands of miles. Similarly, warming along one coast could disrupt monsoon cycles halfway around the continent, triggering chain reactions in forests, wetlands, and inland lakes. In the oceans, currents carried these signals even farther, redistributing heat and nutrients in ways that reshaped marine life. Life responded with quiet resilience. In the arid zones, plants evolved deep roots and waxy leaves to store water against long, dry stretches, while animals adopted nocturnal habits to avoid the day's heat. In wetter regions, species adapted to the rhythm of floods and droughts, breeding during the rainy season when food was abundant, and enduring the lean months in burrows or as dormant seeds. Along the coasts, migrations became finely tuned to seasonal changes in temperature and food supply, drawing vast gatherings of creatures at predictable times each year. The interplay between tectonic motion and climate deepened these transformations. When mountain ranges rose, they altered wind patterns, creating rain shadows that could transform forests into deserts. When rifting began along the coasts, new seas could form, shifting regional climates toward wetter or milder conditions. The landscape itself became a participant in the climate system, and every change in its shape echoed in the patterns of weather and life. From the perspective of deep time, these shifts were early signals of Pangea's eventual division. The forces that would split the supercontinent were not only mechanical, but atmospheric. Variations in temperature between the interior and the coasts placed constant stress on the air currents and moisture flows that bound the climate together. As rifts widened and new ocean basins began to take shape, they would introduce fresh sources of evaporation and rainfall, further fragmenting the continent's once unified weather systems. The breakup would not come in a single moment, but through a cascade of changes, each building on the last, until the very idea of one world continent was a memory preserved only in the stone. For now, though, the unity still held. A traveller could walk from one pole to another without ever crossing an ocean, moving through deserts, forests, mountains and ice. They could feel the changes in air and light with each step, watch constellations shift slowly above, and know that every breath they took came from the same ancient atmosphere circulating across a single, immense stage. Yet in that same air were the faint traces of what was to come, the subtle rearrangements of wind, rain, and temperature that, over millions of years, would tear the stage apart and scatter its pieces across the globe. Life on Pangea was a network of relationships stretched across distances that, in the modern world, would be broken by oceans. In the dense tropical forests near the equator, towering conifers and tree ferns rose in layered canopies, their branches draped with cycads and horsetails. The ground below was shaded and damp, a place where giant amphibians lurked in still pools, and early reptiles moved quietly between ferns, feeding on insects that had grown to extraordinary sizes in the warm, oxygen-rich air. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than a human hand darted above shallow streams, their movements sharp and sudden. The songs of primitive insects filled the air, a constant undertone to the life hidden in the greenery. Farther out into the open plains, the vegetation shifted to hardy seed plants and low cycads, with scattered groves of ginkgos breaking the horizon. These grassless expanses supported herds of large herbivorous reptiles, some moving on four pillar-like legs, others striding upright on two powerful limbs. They grazed on tough leaves and conifer needles, stripping branches clean before moving on. Their movement shaped the land itself, trampling new paths, dispersing seeds in their waste, and attracting predators who shadowed them from a distance. The air vibrated with the calls of these great plant-eaters, deep resonant sounds that could carry for miles, warning of danger or gathering the herd together. Predators ranged widely over these same lands, sleek bipedal hunters with long tails for balance and claws built for gripping prey moved in coordinated packs, communicating with subtle shifts of posture and short bursts of sound. Others relied on ambush, lying in wait along riverbanks or at the edges of dense stands of vegetation, their camouflage blending them into the landscape until they exploded into motion, teeth curved for slicing and skulls built for powerful bites, left marks on the bones of their victims that would be preserved in stone for millions of years. Near the coasts and river deltas, the boundary between land and water blurred. Here, crocodile-like reptiles basked in the sun, slipping into the water with barely a ripple when disturbed. They hunted both in the shallows and on land, capable of sudden bursts of speed that ended in a violent thrash of jaws and tail. In the estuaries, schools of fish moved with the tides, feeding on the nutrients washed down from inland forests. Above them, pterosaurs, reptiles that had taken to the air, soared on leathery wings, their sharp eyes spotting prey in the water before folding their wings and diving with precision. Inland waterways were lifelines for countless species. Rivers carried more than water. They brought seasonal floods that renewed the soil, carrying nutrients from the mountains to the plains. Amphibians bred in the quiet backwaters, their eggs laid in gelatinous masses that clung to reeds. Reptiles followed the rivers as migratory routes, travelling between feeding grounds in predictable cycles. Along the banks, footprints pressed into soft mud told silent stories of passage. A heavy herbivore dragging its tail, a swift predator in pursuit, a pterosaur's brief landing before taking flight again. Not all life on Pangea was large or dramatic. In the leaf litter of forests and the thin soils of deserts, small mammals scurried, their fur insulating them against both the cold nights and the heat of the day. They hunted insects, stole seeds, and lived in burrows, their presence largely unnoticed by the larger creatures that dominated the landscape. These tiny, quick-breeding survivors would prove among the most adaptable when climate shifted and ecosystems faltered. Likewise, the insects themselves were the invisible threads binding the system together, pollinating plants, breaking down dead material, and feeding countless other species. The oceans bordering Pangea were just as alive. Coral-like reefs built by ancient invertebrates created complex habitats that teemed with fish, mollusks, and crustaceans. Marine reptiles patrolled these waters, some built for speed in the chase, others for deep diving into the cooler, darker layers. Large filter feeders moved slowly through plankton-rich zones, straining tiny organisms from the water with every pass. Seabirds of the time, descendants of earlier reptilian flyers, nested on cliffs and islands, their calls mingling with the crash of waves. These interconnected ecosystems were balanced, but never static. A shift in rainfall could ripple outward, shrinking water sources and concentrating prey, which in turn could cause predator numbers to rise before collapsing again when the food was gone. A volcanic eruption could bury a fertile plain in ash, forcing herbivores to move and predators to follow, while simultaneously creating new soils that would eventually attract life back in abundance. Every species existed in this constant state of adjustment, shaped by both the physical geography and the movements of those around them. In the fossil record of Pangea's time, we see not just bones and shells, but signs of these relationships: teeth marks in bone, stomach contents preserved in stone, nests fossilized with eggs still inside. We see entire trackways preserved in mud that dried and hardened, showing predator and prey in the same scene, frozen mid-chase. We see pollen trapped in sediment layers, revealing the plants that flourished in different climates, and ash beds that mark moments when the world changed abruptly. Each of these traces is a fragment of a much larger living picture, one that can only be imagined by piecing together the movement, sound, and texture of this vanished world. Though the unity of Pangea meant that species could range across extraordinary distances, it also meant that extinctions could spread more quickly. A disease that appeared in one region could travel along connected habitats until it reached the far edges of the continent. Likewise, invasive species, plants or animals moving into new territory, could spread without the barrier of oceans, reshaping ecosystems as they went. This interconnectedness was both the strength and the vulnerability of the supercontinent's web of life. For now the balance held. The forests grew, the rivers ran, the predators hunted, and the seas pulsed with life. From the equator to the poles, from the deserts to the reefs, Pangea's living systems operated in a delicate equilibrium, sustained by the very shape of the land. But the same geological restlessness that had brought them together would eventually scatter them apart, isolating species, redirecting migration, and setting evolution on a new course. The stage was still whole, yet behind the scenes the props were shifting, and the cast would soon find themselves in entirely new worlds. The signs of change began quietly, almost imperceptibly, hidden in the rhythms of the land and sea. In the great interior deserts of Pangea, dunes shifted more often than before, their crests reshaped by winds that seemed to blow from new directions. The sparse vegetation retreated even farther toward the few surviving oases, leaving wider expanses of bare sand where only wind-carved rock stood as witness to the shifting climate. In some valleys, rivers that had once flowed reliably each season now failed to reach the lowlands, drying into a string of disconnected pools that shimmered under the sun before vanishing entirely. Herds of herbivores, once steady in their migrations, began arriving earlier or later than expected, driven by changes in the growth of plants they relied upon. Along the coasts, the tides seemed subtly altered. Storms came with new intensity in certain regions, bringing heavier rains and more violent winds than the memory of recent generations could recall. In other places, once predictable seasonal rains weakened, leaving forests drier and more vulnerable to fire. Lightning storms in these dry spells ignited vast stretches of woodland, sending smoke into the skies and driving animals to flee ahead of advancing flames. The fires, while destructive, also cleared space for new growth, and in their wake, certain plants flourished that had been rare before. Their seeds adapted to sprout in the nutrient-rich ash left behind. Farther inland, the first hints of tectonic restlessness began to shape the horizon. In places where the crust was stretching, the ground fractured into long, straight valleys, their walls marked by fresh rock exposed to the air for the first time in millions of years. Lakes formed in the depressions, gathering rainwater and runoff, becoming havens for wildlife even as the land around them shifted. These rifts were narrow at first, more like scars than wounds, but they hinted at the forces working silently below, forces that would, over the span of deep time, open into new seas. Such changes did not go unnoticed by the creatures of Pangea. Predators followed prey into new territories, their ranges expanding or contracting in response to the shifting patterns of food and water. Species that had once thrived in vast, unbroken habitats began to find themselves isolated by emerging geographical barriers, new mountain ridges, widening river channels, or stretches of land turned to desert. The interconnected web of life that had once spanned the continent began to develop subtle seams, places where the links grew thinner and the flow of life was redirected. Even the seas showed signs of transformation. Currents altered their paths as the shapes of coastlines shifted, bringing warm water to places that had been cool and carrying nutrients away from once rich fishing grounds. Coral-like reefs experienced surges of growth in some regions and declines in others as water temperatures and clarity changed. Marine reptiles, dependent on specific feeding zones, began to migrate differently, their movements altering the patterns of predators that hunted them from above. Pterosaurs too adjusted their routes, appearing in new coastal areas where conditions now favoured their nesting and feeding. The climate itself seemed increasingly unstable. Periods of warmth lengthened in some places, while others experienced prolonged cool spells. This uneven distribution of heat created new wind patterns, shifting storms into unfamiliar paths. Mountain ranges that once intercepted moist air now stood in the path of drier winds, and the ecosystems on their slopes responded in kind. On one side, forests thinned and gave way to scrubland. On the other, rain-fed valleys bloomed more intensely than before, attracting new concentrations of life. These shifts were not catastrophic in a single moment, but their cumulative effect began to reshape the face of Pangea, preparing it for the great fragmentation still to come. From a distance, the continent still appeared whole and unbroken, an immense and unified world of land. A traveller could cross it from one end to the other without ever stepping into the sea. Yet for those who lived within it, the changes were tangible. A familiar waterhole might be gone from one season to the next. A predator that had never before hunted in a certain valley might now appear, drawn by the movement of prey displaced from its usual grounds. The plants that once flowered at a predictable time might now open their blooms weeks earlier, or not at all, in response to the shifting rhythms of temperature and rainfall. In the deep geological record, these were the first threads of a larger unravelling. Sediment layers would one day reveal the increased frequency of droughts, the ash from wildfires, the fine dust carried from expanding deserts, and the pollen from plants migrating into new territories. Fossils would show sudden gaps where species vanished from a region, only to reappear far away or disappear entirely. The pattern was one of motion, sometimes slow and gradual, sometimes abrupt and sharp, marking the continent's slow transition toward a more fragmented and unstable world. Yet life, as it always had, continued to adapt. New alliances formed in the ecosystems of Pangea as species learned to coexist in changing habitats. Opportunistic plants and animals took advantage of disturbances, spreading into spaces left empty by less adaptable neighbours. The balance of power shifted within food webs. Predators rose or fell in prominence, depending on the stability of their prey, and scavengers thrived in the spaces between abundance and scarcity. The seeds of the future, both literal and figurative, were already sown in these adjustments, setting the stage for the ecosystems that would evolve after Pangea's eventual division. In the quiet between storms, the land still felt timeless. Rivers still carved valleys, forests still whispered in the wind, and herds still moved across the plains under open skies. But in the depths of the earth, and in the patterns of the air, the first real steps toward the end of the supercontinent were underway, patient and unstoppable. What appeared eternal was, in truth, already in motion, the slow machinery of planetary change turning toward an outcome no creature alive could foresee. It began in isolated pockets, far from the notice of any wandering creature, a slow heaving of the land, a faint tremor underfoot that faded before it could be recognized as anything more than the settling of stone. In certain valleys the ground split open in narrow fractures, so clean-edged that rainwater poured in and vanished into the dark. In other places the land lifted in broad, shallow swells, raising hills where flat plains had stood for ages. Along the edges of Pangea, the restless crust expressed itself in lines of volcanoes. Their cones knew enough that their slopes were still raw and sharp, unsoftened by wind or rain. From these volcanic arcs came both creation and destruction. Basaltic lava poured into the sea, hissing as it met the waves, building new land that extended the coastline outward in jagged tongues. Ash clouds rose high enough to veil the sun for weeks, casting strange light over forests and plains, unsettling the natural rhythms of feeding, breeding, and migration. In the seas nearby, the sudden influx of minerals from the volcanic flows enriched plankton blooms, which in turn drew swarms of fish and the predators that fed on them. But closer to the vents, the water grew hot and acidic, bleaching reefs and driving marine life away until the eruption subsided. On land, fault zones deepened and widened, slowly altering the contours of entire regions. Valleys once fed by broad rivers now drained toward new depressions, creating inland seas and long, narrow lakes that teemed with life in their early stages. These waterways acted as both barriers and corridors, cutting off some migrations while enabling others to move into previously isolated territories. Animals that had once shared ranges now found themselves separated, their populations beginning to diverge in subtle ways, each adapting to the new constraints of their changed surroundings. Mountain ranges rose where crustal plates collided, their slopes still bare of forest, streaked with landslides where the fresh rock resisted the grip of roots. In the rain shadows behind these mountains, climate shifted abruptly, drying forests into grasslands, shrinking wetlands into seasonal ponds. Species adapted to wetter conditions, retreated toward more hospitable zones, compressing their ranges and increasing competition in the places where water remained steady. In the highlands, new habitats opened to those capable of surviving cooler air and thinner soil, drawing both opportunists and specialists into an evolving mosaic of life. The proto-seas forming at the rift zones were narrow at first, more like elongated gulfs than true oceans. They were calm compared to the great surrounding waters, their shores marked by sheltered lagoons and tidal flats. These environments became nurseries for marine life, safe havens for young fish and reptiles, and feeding grounds for flocks of pterosaurs that wheeled overhead in the warm air. Over time, as the rifts widened, the tidal patterns grew stronger, and the exchange of water with the open ocean increased, blending species from different regions and setting the stage for new ecological interactions. The physical transformation of the land carried with it an invisible change in the atmosphere. Volcanic gases altered the composition of the air, and the distribution of continents began to influence the global wind patterns in ways unseen before. Moisture that had once been carried deep into the interior of Pangea was now intercepted by mountains or lost to new seas, further drying the heart of the continent. At the same time, warm currents along the fresh coastlines created localized climates where rain fell more often, feeding new forests that clung to the edges of the rift zones. Life responded with a mix of resilience and loss. Certain plants with seeds capable of drifting on the wind or floating in water quickly colonized the fresh volcanic soils and the young islands offshore. Others, less mobile, dwindled in their shrinking habitats. Predators adapted to the new landscapes, learning to hunt along the broken terrain of faulted valleys and volcanic ridges, where cover was plentiful, but the prey less predictable. In the seas, opportunistic species flourished in the nutrient-rich shallows, while those tied to stable coral-like reefs struggled as their habitats were buried or eroded. The geological shift was not uniform across Pangea. In some regions, the land remained stable for thousands of years at a stretch, while in others, the changes seemed relentless. Quakes, eruptions, and the slow, steady pull of the crust working like an invisible tide. This unevenness created a patchwork of conditions across the continent, where ancient ecosystems still thrived in one place, while entirely new ones emerged in another. Yet beneath all of it, the same force was at work: the slow tearing of the supercontinent. The rift valleys would deepen, the volcanic arcs would stretch farther, and the proto-seas would widen into true oceans. What was once a single immense stage for life would fracture into separate lands, each with its own climates, migrations, and evolutionary paths. To the creatures alive in this moment, the change was gradual enough to pass unnoticed in a single lifetime. But in the record of the Earth, it was a decisive turning point, the first clear step toward the world as we would one day recognize it. And in the stillness between events, the air carried a subtle tension, as if the land itself was holding its breath before the next shift. The rivers still ran, the forests still rustled, and the seas still rolled to their tides, but deep below, the planet's slow machinery kept turning, preparing to pull Pangea apart, piece by piece. The widening of the rift valleys was no longer something hidden beneath the canopy of forests, or the gentle swell of plains. In certain regions, the ground now opened into yawning chasms, their walls plunging steeply into shadow, where strange new plants clung to ledges, and the echoes of falling stone rolled upward like distant thunder. The proto-seas that had once been shallow, narrow gulfs now stretched wide enough that a traveller standing on one shore could no longer see the other. the horizon blending water and sky into a single, seamless line. Salt winds swept inland, carrying the scent of the ocean deep into territories that had never known its presence. Along these new coastlines, life reorganized itself. Beaches of pale volcanic sand gave way to tidal marshes, where reeds swayed in the brackish water, and schools of small fish darted among their roots. Flocks of pterosaurs circled overhead, their sharp cries cutting through the constant hiss of waves. In the shallows, shelled creatures and agile crustaceans explored the fresh niches created by each tide, while larger marine reptiles cruised the deeper waters just beyond the breakers. On land, predators followed these new shores, learning to hunt in the margins, where land met sea, stalking both terrestrial prey and the unwary creatures that ventured from the water at low tide. Inland, the fragmentation of habitats continued. Wide rivers that once connected regions now spilled into the growing seas, creating estuaries rich with life, but cutting off old migration routes. Species that had once roamed unbroken landscapes began to split into isolated populations, each adapting in subtle ways to the conditions of its own new range. In some valleys, herds grew smaller but more specialized, relying on particular plants that thrived in the altered climate. In other areas, generalists, animals able to eat a wide range of foods, flourished, their adaptability allowing them to survive in shifting conditions where specialists could not. The climate across Pangea's fractured edges began to diverge more dramatically. Along the coasts of the widening seas, moist air rose to form near constant clouds, feeding forests lush with ferns, cycads, and towering conifers. These forests were alive with sound, the calls of reptiles, the beating of wings, the rustle of undergrowth, as small mammals and early dinosaurs moved through the shadows. By contrast, the interiors of the remaining land masses grew hotter and drier, with grassless plains giving way to expanding deserts. Winds carried fine dust for hundreds of miles, coating leaves, filling tracks, and settling into the layers of lakes and riverbeds, where it would one day be read as a record of aridity. Volcanic activity continued to sculpt the young coastlines and the rift zones themselves. Some eruptions built small islands just offshore, their black rock still steaming in the cool air of morning. These islands were quickly colonized by wind-blown seeds and by birds and reptiles seeking nesting sites free from land predators. Over decades, soil formed in the cracks and hollows, drawing in more life until the islands became stepping stones for migration between the growing land masses. In other places, lava flows spilled directly into the sea, creating temporary barriers to movement and turning nearby waters cloudy with suspended minerals. The movement of the crust was slow in human terms, yet fast enough in geological time to transform coastlines within a few thousand years. Bays deepened into gulfs, gulfs opened into straits, and straits widened until they became unmistakably separate seas. Where there had once been an unbroken horizon of land, there were now blue corridors stretching to the edges of sight. These waters began to influence not just the climate, but the very identity of the life on either side, creating the first true sense of separation in a world that had once been entirely connected. The fossil record of this era would one day show a branching in the tree of life, as species on one side of a divide evolved differently from their counterparts on the other. The shapes of skulls, the proportions of limbs, the details of teeth, all would begin to tell the story of populations shaped by isolation. Some would eventually vanish, their adaptations too narrow to withstand further change, while others would radiate into entirely new forms, filling the niches opened by the shifting land and sea. For the living creatures of Pangea, these changes were simply the background to existence. A predator learned the new hunting grounds as instinctively as it learned the curve of its claws. A herd moved to a new grazing area because the old one had dried, never knowing it was part of a migration that would leave descendants cut off from their kin. The air smelled different, the winds blew from unfamiliar directions, the stars rose and set in slightly altered positions as the land itself shifted beneath them. The changes were constant, yet slow enough that life could keep pace most of the time. Still, there were moments when the earth reminded its inhabitants that it could change in an instant. A sudden quake could drop a section of coastline into the sea, sending waves racing outward to batter distant shores. An eruption could bury a forest in a single night, preserving the shapes of its trees in the cooling rock. A new island could rise from the ocean floor within the span of a season, only to be eroded back into the waves over centuries. Each event was a reminder of the planet's restless nature, of the fact that Pangea's time as a unified continent was not just ending, but doing so with a force that would shape the destiny of every species it held. And so the rift widened, grain by grain, wave by wave, quake by quake. The outlines of the future continents were still invisible, hidden in the slow choreography of plate and mantle, but their birth was underway. For now the animals still roamed as they always had, the forests still whispered in the wind, and the seas still breathed in tides, but the world was no longer the same stage it had been. The curtain was rising on an entirely new act in Earth's history. The young seas were no longer tentative, no longer narrow enough to be mistaken for great rivers or enclosed gulfs. Their waters now breathed with the deep, rhythmic tides of the open ocean, pulling and pushing against the freshly formed shores. Along their edges, waves ground volcanic rock into sand, shaping long crescents of beach where none had existed before. Inland breezes carried the salt smell far into valleys, so that even creatures miles from the shore could taste the change in the air. On cloudless days, the light over these waters shimmered with a brilliance that seemed new to the world, a sharp reflection of a surface that had not known the sun for millions of years. With the permanence of these seas came the birth of true coastal worlds. Estuaries teemed with life, their brackish waters a meeting place for freshwater fish venturing downstream, and marine species pushing inland with the tides. Mangrove-like vegetation began to take root in the sheltered bays, their tangled roots catching silt and creating safe havens for the young of countless species. Here small reptiles basked on mud banks, waiting for fish to come within striking range, while flocks of pterosaurs wheeled overhead, diving suddenly to snatch prey from the surface. At night, the quiet was broken by the soft splashes of nocturnal hunters, creatures perfectly adapted to this shifting zone between land and sea. Inland, the consequences of separation grew sharper. Regions once linked by wide grasslands now lay across from one another on opposing shores. The steady exchange of life between them reduced to the rare crossing by flight or floating vegetation. Populations that had once mingled freely began to drift apart in their habits, diets, and physical form. On one coast, a herbivore species developed broader teeth for grinding the tough coastal plants that thrived in salt-sprayed air. Across the water, its relatives retained narrower jaws for grazing on inland vegetation, their bodies leaner from covering greater distances between food sources. Climate patterns deepened their divergence. The coasts bathed in steady moisture grew lush, with forests that echoed constantly with the calls of amphibians, reptiles, and primitive birds. The air was heavy here, thick with the scent of wet earth and resin from towering conifers. In the interiors, the story was starkly different. Deserts stretched further than before, their sands moving in restless waves beneath relentless sun. The wind that once carried clouds inland now dropped its rain over the coastal ranges, leaving only dry heat for the central plains. In some areas, hardy shrubs clung to life, their roots probing deep for water, their leaves small and tough to resist evaporation. Volcanism still shaped the edges of this evolving world. Some islands near the rift zones grew large enough to support forests, becoming stepping stones that bridged the gap between the new coasts. These islands played a crucial role in dispersing life. Seeds caught in the feathers of birds or in the fur of reptiles found new ground to grow, while small animals crossed unknowingly into what would one day be entirely separate realms. Yet not all crossings were successful. Many species could not adapt to the conditions they encountered on the far side, and their brief expansion ended in disappearance. In the seas themselves, life adapted with astonishing speed. Warm currents brought nutrients that sustained massive plankton blooms, which in turn supported shoals of fish so dense they darkened the water. Large marine reptiles patrolled these feeding grounds, their movements slow and deliberate as they circled before striking with sudden bursts of speed. Along the seafloor, corals and shell-building creatures began constructing reefs in places where conditions allowed, creating new centres of marine biodiversity. These reefs acted as both sanctuary and trap, sheltering countless small species, while also drawing predators to their teeming abundance. The separation of land masses began to echo in the evolutionary record. Creatures that had once been variations on a shared design were now diverging visibly. Limb proportions shifted to suit new terrains, coloration adapted to different climates, and behaviours changed to fit the available resources. Over time, these differences would become so pronounced that the descendants of once interbreeding populations could no longer recognise each other as kin. The process was slow but relentless, guided not by intention but by the silent force of isolation. To the inhabitants of this changing earth, the transformation was simply the way of things. A herd followed the same path each year, until one day the path ended at the edge of the sea. A predator hunted a familiar species until it vanished from its range, replaced by a new, unfamiliar form. The songs of certain forest dwellers no longer matched across the water, their calls drifting into separate dialects. The connections that had bound Pangea's life together were thinning, replaced by new webs spun within the confines of each emerging land. And yet, for all the separation, there remained moments of overlap. Storm-driven flotsam carried seeds and insects across narrow channels, sometimes washing ashore on a distant beach where they took root in foreign soil. Birds capable of long flight still bridged the divide, their presence a reminder that the new boundaries were not yet absolute. But the trend was clear. Each passing century widened the gap, deepened the differences, and moved the world further from the unity it had once known. The age of a single, boundless supercontinent was over in all but name. The lines of division were drawn not in ink, but in stone, water, and wind, and the story of life was being rewritten in the language of separation. The seas would grow, the climates would sharpen in contrast, and the creatures of each realm would follow their own paths into the future, carrying within them the legacy of a world that had been whole. The waters that had once been narrow channels between rifted lands now rolled with the breadth and depth of true oceans. Their surfaces glittered in the sun by day, and burned silver under the moon by night, stretching so far that even the tallest pterosaur in flight could not see the opposite shore. The smell of salt grew stronger here, carried inland on winds that had travelled uninterrupted across hundreds of miles of open sea. These winds brought both life and destruction. Cloud banks heavy with rain that fed lush coastal forests, and storms that rose from the deep with a force capable of reshaping entire shorelines in a single night. Along the coasts, the land had adapted to the constant rhythm of tides and waves. Beaches lay wide and pale in the morning, only to vanish beneath the afternoon surge. Rocky headlands stood against the sea, their faces carved by centuries of relentless water into shelves, arches, and caves. In the shallows, kelp-like plants swayed with the currents, providing shelter for fish whose shimmering scales caught the light like coins on a riverbed. Above, seabirds with long narrow wings soared in effortless arcs, diving with precision into the schools of fish that moved in dark, shifting clouds beneath the surface. Inland, the separation of continents had become an undeniable reality. Entire ecosystems now existed in complete isolation from one another. Species that had once shared a common ancestor diverged beyond easy recognition. On one landmass, a small predator developed longer limbs for running across open plains. On another, its relatives became stockier, their powerful legs built for ambush in dense forests. The difference was not just in form, but in the sounds they made, the patterns of their movements, and the strategies they used to survive. Climates sharpened into distinct personalities. The interiors of some continents became fertile and temperate, with regular rainfall supporting vast forests of towering conifers and cycads. Elsewhere, central deserts expanded beneath unbroken skies, their dunes shifting daily under the push of steady, drying winds. The coast nearest the equator grew hot and humid, heavy with the scent of flowering plants and buzzing with the activity of countless insects. Farther toward the poles, cooler currents brought fog that drifted over rocky shores and into the valleys beyond, feeding mosses and low shrubs. The oceans themselves became agents of change. Currents carried warm water into high latitudes and returned with cold, nutrient-rich streams that sustained immense blooms of plankton. These blooms drew fish in numbers so vast they seemed to turn the water into a living, moving mass. The predators that followed, marine reptiles with jaws longer than a human body, swift fish with sleek cutting fins, thrived in this abundance. Reefs flourished in tropical zones, their complex structures sheltering everything from tiny invertebrates to hunters lying in wait for prey to stray too close. The growing distances between continents began to erase the last traces of Pangea's unity. Animals that could not fly or swim across the widening seas had no path to reconnect. Each landmass became a separate theatre of evolution, where unique combinations of climate, terrain, and species interactions shaped life in ways impossible anywhere else. The fossil record would later reveal these differences in exquisite detail, bones bearing marks of adaptations that told a story of lives lived entirely apart from their distant relatives. Still, there were moments when the barrier of the ocean could be crossed. Violent storms uprooted entire mats of vegetation and carried them for weeks across the waves, delivering small reptiles or insects to new shores. Birds and flying reptiles occasionally made the journey under favourable winds, their arrival rare but significant. Seeds with hard, buoyant shells drifted from one land to another, washing up on beaches where they sprouted into unfamiliar soil. These exchanges were fleeting connections, fragile threads that tied the continents together, even as the ocean widened. For the living, the oceans were both a boundary and a source. They dictated the patterns of climate, influenced the migrations of animals, and provided resources that sustained life along the coasts. Inland, the memory of a connected world faded with each passing generation. The paths of migration were now set within the borders of each continent, and predators and prey knew only the ranges that the sea allowed them. The idea of a single, unified landmass was as unreachable to them as the far shore itself. Yet in the quiet moments between storms, when the waves lay calm and the horizon blurred into the sky, the ocean seemed less like a wall and more like a vast, shifting mirror, reflecting the light of the same sun, the same moon, that still bound all lands beneath its path. The continents might be parting, but they remained pieces of a single planet, their fates still intertwined in ways that would only become clear in the ages to come. And so the age of Pangea's final unbroken horizon passed into memory, carried forward not in the minds of its creatures, but in the slow, unyielding record of the earth itself. The continents were becoming themselves, distinct and separate, yet forever marked by the time when they had been one. The oceans now rolled between the continents with the confidence of permanence, their vast blue surfaces unbroken except by the slow pulse of waves and the occasional dark mass of an island rising from the depths. No longer were these waters the narrow rifts of an earlier age. They were immense and self-contained, each with its own rhythms, currents and storms. The continents they separated had taken on their own shapes, their own climates, their own living patterns, and the ancient unity of Pangea existed only in the deep bones of the earth and in the fossils buried far beneath the soil. On one continent, rainforests breathed in steady cycles, their canopies alive with the calls of reptiles and the flutter of primitive birds. In the damp undergrowth, early mammals darted between ferns and cycads, careful to avoid the shadows of predators gliding silently above. Far to the south, another landmass lay under the weight of long dry seasons, its interior a desert of shifting dunes and cracked lake beds, where survival meant endurance, and every step carried the memory of thirst. Between them the ocean carried the stories of both, nutrients from river mouths feeding distant reefs, volcanic ash from coastal eruptions settling in layers on the seafloor thousands of miles away. Life had followed the course set by separation. Herbivores shaped by the forests had grown taller and more agile, feeding on the high leaves, untouched by smaller species. On another shore, their distant cousins bore heavier frames and powerful jaws for grinding the hardy plants of arid plains. Predators, too, bore the signature of their environments, lean, long-limbed hunters of open ground on one landmass, shorter, muscular stalkers in dense, shadowed woodlands on another. Over time, these differences deepened into new identities, until creatures that once could have shared the same ground would meet as strangers. The oceans became the great architects of climate. Warm equatorial currents carried heat toward the poles, while cold currents flowed back along the depths, balancing temperatures and dictating where rain would fall. Coastal regions thrived in this equilibrium, their richness in life unmatched by the increasingly extreme conditions of the continental interiors. Storm systems swirled across the open water, some gentle, others fierce enough to leave permanent marks on the shorelines they struck. The line between land and sea was never still. Each tide, each surge, each century redrew it in subtle ways. Islands, scattered like stepping stones across the waves, became laboratories of evolution. Separated from the continents, their inhabitants adapted in isolation, some growing smaller, in resource-limited environments, others developing unusual traits in the absence of natural predators. These places were fragile, their ecosystems easily unsettled by even the smallest change, yet they flourished in their own contained worlds, adding to the growing mosaic of life shaped by distance. And still, the continents drifted. The movement was so slow that no living creature could perceive it, yet relentless enough that in millions of years more, the map of the planet would be unrecognizable again. The separation of Pangea was not the end of a story, but part of a longer rhythm, a cycle of coming together and breaking apart that had played out before and would play out again. Mountains would rise and crumble, seas would open and close, climates would shift and reset, and life would adapt, always finding a way to fill the spaces the Earth created. In this moment, though, the world was in balance. The oceans, young yet vast, tied the continents together in unseen ways, through currents, through the migration of birds, through the drifting seeds that found new homes on distant shores. The memory of a single supercontinent was carried forward not in the minds of its inhabitants, but in the quiet, continuous processes of the planet itself. Each wave that broke on a beach had travelled from somewhere else. Each gust of wind carried the scent of another land, and each star that rose above the horizon shone on every continent in turn. The age of Pangea had ended, but the Earth had not lost its unity. It remained one world, its surface ever changing, its life forever adapting, its history written in stone and water for those who would one day read it. And though the continents now stood apart, they were still connected by the deep memory of their shared past, a memory that would resurface, piece by piece, in the work of future eyes and hands, piecing together the story of a time when all lands were one.